Thank you very much. I'm very conscious that it's a Friday. It's almost 5 o'clock. This is the last speaker of the last session, so I'll try to be brief. But I want to begin really by thanking the organizers for a wonderful, wonderful conference these last 2 days. This is my first visit to this beautiful country, and I've learned a lot. By way of background, I am a lawyer and an economist, so I guess that makes us four lawyers on the panel. I've also had the privilege of having been a civil servant in my own country and having served as a magistrate in court, which has taught me a lot. And sitting here today, I'm reminded of a story in one of the countries in this part of the world not so long ago, where we had gone with our team and we had met with the Chief Justice, and we wanted to understand what was the situation in terms of companies which were filing cases in court, companies against companies, state owned enterprises against the government, private companies against the government. And the answer was very interesting. The Chief Justice said that how is it possible for the state to be wrong? It is not possible. And we had an interesting discussion after that. But the point is that I heard an echo of this in some of the questions perhaps a little while ago. And to me, that brings home very much a global issue, I think, that we are all confronting, and we often perhaps don't recognize it for what it's worth. And before I begin, I must tell you that I don't want to go through every slide in my presentation. We will touch upon the points. But I did want to talk to you a little bit about 3 or 4 issues which I think are relevant when you think about the law and the economy. First of all, consider these three concepts of the state, the economy, and society. Yeah. And from ancient times, I think law and legal systems have tried to be the glue in a way that holds these three concepts together. And when the law or a legal system is in consonance, is synchronized with the wishes and aspirations of a society or a state, you tend to have well functioning legal systems, you tend to have certainty. And that's not true just of today, it goes back to thousands of years ago in each of the societies we have come from. At the same time, if you look at the world we live in today, of which your country, Belarus, is a part, consider 4 or 5 characteristics of the world today that we live in. First of all, nobody has lived in a world where change is so rapid. We live in a world of change, and we have to be comfortable with that fact. Second, we live in a world that is becoming increasingly globalized, where societies and economies and states and individuals are connected with each other more closely than ever before. This has never been the case and is going to only increase, I think, going forward. Thirdly, we have never lived in a time where the flow of capital has been so great and so intensive across different economies. Fourthly, I think we have never lived in a time where the flow of human beings from one part of the world to the other has been so intensive, so unpredictable, and so great in terms of volume. You referred to this in your remarks. And whether you talk about refugees who go from one country to another, whether you talk about migrants who go from one country to another or between different places in one's own country, what we call internally displaced persons, this is a hugely defining characteristic of our world today. And this flow of humans within societies, between societies, also puts a lot of stresses on economies, legal systems, the law, and the judiciary and other elements of the justice system. And different countries are trying to deal with it differently. We see in Europe, for example, where countries like Germany, your systems are being stressed because of the volume of cases connected with this that your courts and your civil service and your government has to handle. So that's something that we need to keep in mind, and Belarus is very much a part of that world. Next, we've never lived in a world where flows of information have been growing so rapidly and where they are driving so much of the change, for good and bad, that we see in the world today. We have also never lived in a world where laws are changing so rapidly. And perhaps, my friends from Belarus, you can relate to this. You live in a country, you live in a part of the world where the speed of transformation and transition in the last 20 odd years has been breathtaking. Think of where you were 20 years ago and where you are now. Belarus today is a country with a per capita GDP, I think, of about $6,000. It's an enormous road you've traveled. And if you look across the world today, and we talk today, sitting here, about the law and the economy, we live in the age of information, we live in the age of internet, we live in the age of social media, where Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and all the other applications define so much of our interactions, of our knowledge about the world, of our attitudes. And I take you back to where I started from: law, society, and the economy. And clearly, when there are so many questions in Belarus today about your legal system, about your laws, how closely does it help facilitate the change you're looking for, or the economic growth that you're looking for? These are valid questions, not just in Belarus, but in, I think, every country in the world. So let me take you to one slide that I wanted to show you, which is, you might ask, what does the World Bank have to do with this? These are issues of law and justice, and you deal with economics. Yeah, true. Some time ago, a very eminent lawyer friend of mine asked me, what is the difference between God and a lawyer? I said, I don't know. And she goes, well, God doesn't think he's a lawyer. Now, the thing is, law is too important to be left just to judges and lawyers. And I say that having been a lawyer and having been a judge myself, because it affects every part of your life, your interactions, and your society, right? In my own country, I come from India, we have a legal system that's pretty vast, but hugely inefficient. We have millions of cases which are backlogged, people don't get justice. We have civil cases that can drag on for 10, 20, 30 years. But having said that, the internet and electronics is changing that slowly but surely. And we're seeing that even in the midst of so many problems, you can have progress. Here's another story that you might be able to relate to. One of the privileges that the World Bank had was to be associated with Russia since 1995 on issues of legal and judicial reform, along with many other partners. I had the privilege of working in Russia since 2005, and we had the privilege of working with three Chief Justices, Mr. Lebedev of the Supreme Court, Mr. Ivanov from the Supreme Arbitrage Court, which subsequently was abolished, and Chief Justice Zorkin of the Constitutional Court. One of the questions I got asked by each of them is, why is the World Bank interested in courts and justice and the law? You guys are supposed to be dealing with economic development. True. The reason we are interested is that a good legal system, a well-functioning justice system, a responsive justice system is important for economic and social development. And I don't need to go into the details. You can see this on the screen. But there is a very good reason why we are involved in this. But we never do it alone. We do it with the country, we do it with other partners, and we do it understanding that there are many interconnections between the law and the economy that sometimes are unclear. I don't think anybody has a silver bullet for the issue of what makes for a good legal system. If we had, there would be much more of it. But I want to leave you with three thoughts for this afternoon. The first thought is, let's look at the issue of the law and the economy from what we economists like to call the demand side. Who are the people who access the justice system? Mainly firms and individuals. But interestingly, in almost every country, the largest litigator perhaps tends to be the state, either as a defendant or as a plaintiff. Think about it. And when the state, in pretty much every country, has such an enormous presence in the legal and judicial system, that can sometimes throw up challenges towards getting to a more efficient and a more responsive legal system. And I'll give you just a couple of examples. We were talking today about judges and lawyers. We were talking about law students, law schools. But there are also other important elements of the justice system that are important to the economy. Two of them are bailiffs and notaries. In your own country, in Belarus, I'm sure notaries play a very important role in individuals' lives, from births to deaths to recording of events and property transactions, and the same for the corporate and the other elements of the economy. But in discussions about legal and judicial reform, not that much attention is paid to the important economic role of notaries and how having an efficient notarial system, a clean notarial system, is important for the health of a country's legal system. Think again about one other element of the system, which is the bailiffs, the ones who actually enforce the decisions of the court, decisions of administrative bodies. Having been a civil servant and a judge, I can tell you, even if you have a final decision in a court of law, it doesn't matter if you cannot get that decision enforced. Justice is not complete until the decision is enforced. Now, you might say that, sure, things are different if it's a civil law system, it might be different in the Anglo-Saxon system. But I would submit to you today that the difference between these so-called legal systems is actually getting more and more blurred as countries draw on what is good and well-functioning in other countries and bring it into their own system. And so you have systems today where civil law systems are borrowing from the Anglo-Saxon tradition. Anglo-Saxon legal systems are borrowing from what's good from the civil law tradition. And in countries in transition, especially we have seen in the last 2 decades, I'm sure, that there is so much of borrowing that countries are now moving towards a more hybrid system, which is fine, so long as it's responsive and it's easily accessible. That's great. The issue is it becoming more accessible? And that's where the issue with the bailiffs comes up. Bailiffs operate in a very strange environment in most countries. There's not much public discussion about them. In countries in Northern Europe, where you tend to have mixed systems, where you have public bailiffs and private bailiffs, because of a long tradition and because of good governance, typically they tend to perform pretty efficiently. In countries like Belarus and other countries in transition in this part of the world, the tendency is to have public bailiffs. Some countries are moving to a mixed model. But as an economist, let me put a couple of data points in front of you. We did a study in Ukraine some time back on the justice system, And we looked at the issue of bailiffs. And one of the figures we came up with was that in a country like Ukraine, the total value of unresolved cases lying with bailiffs, not enforced, was about one third of the country's GDP. Then we were very surprised by this, so we went deeper and we took out all the cases that were dead cases or where there was money but not property behind it. The final figure we came at was somewhere, I think, between 17 and 18% of a country's GDP, which is massive if you look at it from the perspective of the GDP of a country. Ukraine is now in the middle of introducing private bailiffs. Now, this is not the World Bank's view, this is my personal view. I think that the attention being given to this mixed system introduction is actually taking attention away from the big cases worth hundreds of millions of dollars that are still lying unresolved and to which public attention will not be focused because everybody is thinking about, oh, we are changing systems. And I come from a country where it's common for wealthy people and wealthy firms to pay not to get judicial orders enforced. It happens all over the world in different forms, in some places more common than others. Second data point about bailiffs and enforcement. And this is all public information. I'm not telling you anything that's not in the public domain. Kazakhstan, oil-rich, gas-rich economy. We looked at enforcement there because the legal system is trying to modernize. We tried to get a list of the 100 largest enforcement cases. It took us about a year. If you look at that list, there are cases where money is owed to the state. There are cases where money is owed to state-owned enterprises, and there are cases where money is owed to private companies. Our team worked for about a year with the Ministry of Justice, which is in charge of the enforcement function. And the approximate total value of unenforced cases in a country like Kazakhstan, according to the government's own figures, varies between 18 and 25 billion dollars. Okay? Of this, our estimate is that about a third of this is actually money that is owed to the state, to the treasury. So imagine if the treasury were to get $8 billion more, that would improve government's fiscal position, right? But none of that has been collected yet after 2 years of trying. Of the remainder, a significant amount is owed to the private sector by other private sector firms. But the fact is that until the order is enforced, that capital which the private sector creditor is supposed to get from the private sector debtor is not being transferred or access to it is not being obtained. Imagine what it would mean to the economy if 8 to 10 billion dollars of capital were suddenly unlocked, available for use by the private sector. You could create jobs, economic growth, blah, blah, blah. So, my submission to you today is that while it's absolutely appropriate and proper that discussions of law and the economy and legal systems talk about judges and lawyers, we must not forget the other parts of the system, each of which plays an incredibly important role, and some of which, like bailiffs and notaries, play an incredibly important economic role. And that brings me to my second last point, which is that in Belarus, I saw that in 2013, 2014, you integrated your economic courts with the courts of universal jurisdiction. I think the change took effect from 2014, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure what the effect of that has been, because in this part of the world, there has been in many countries a long tradition of economic courts which have built up their own jurisprudence and decisions and a certain amount of certainty, predictability. Where these specialized courts have been merged into the more universal court system, it can have positive and negative impacts. I'm not sure what's happened in Belarus, but typically you could have an increase in efficiency. You could perhaps also lose the advantages that come from specialization. And if in the process of merging the economic courts with the general courts, you also at the top create a chamber inside the Supreme Court, as I think you did in Belarus, that again could have positive and negative consequences. I don't know what the situation is here. But in many countries, because the economy is becoming so important and the role of government tends to be shrinking in many countries, how commercial and economic cases are dealt with becomes incredibly important. And it can have macrofiscal consequences. It can have consequences for investment, both domestic and foreign. And I think it'll be very interesting to see in Belarus where this merger of these court systems is going to take your judicial system and what its impact will be on your economy and on investment and on jobs. Let me stop here from now. I think we are running a little bit short of time, but I wanted to leave you with 4 or 5 takeaways in terms of thinking about the economy and the law. First of all, I think context is everything. In other words, what works for a Germany may not work for a Belarus. So you have to figure out what is best for your legal system, your economy, and your society. And sometimes it means borrowing, sometimes it means adapting, sometimes it might mean not fixing what's not broken just for the sake of change. Think about it. Second, at the end of the day, I think in every country's judicial and legal systems, what counts most of all is public trust and confidence. You can make technical changes, you can make legal changes, you can make changes about how you approach the structure of your judiciary and legal system. But if at the end of the day, public trust and confidence does not increase, that becomes a source of concern and it tells you that you need to do something different. And public trust and confidence is extremely difficult and it takes a long time for it to improve. So don't expect results in the short term if you're thinking about public trust. It is going to take time and you have to give that time and you have to track it and see where it's going. Third, we all talk about institutions and how important they are. And indeed, they are important. But I believe that people who lead institutions are equally important. We have seen around the world in the last few years what has happened to institutions, what has happened when institutions change for the better or the worse. So, therefore, it's extremely important that the leaders of the institutions care for the institutions. Otherwise, if you have a mismatch, then you could have problems ahead. Fourthly, in the age of the internet, in the age of social media, yes, electronic access, e-services are incredibly important. But you have to remember that these services and these systems need to be designed in tune with the needs of those who are going to use them, not from the perspective of the providers. And that's a mistake we very often make. When systems are designed for the benefit of providers, and not for the users, you tend to have a dysfunctional system. So that's a lesson we've learned, and I think that's something that is incredibly important. Lastly, I think we've also learned in the World Bank, in our work with different countries, at the end of the day, it's all about implementation. You can have the best laws, you can have the best policies. It doesn't matter if they are not implemented. What does that mean for us? I think it goes back to the point I made about context being everything. And very often you read about working groups and committees and task forces being set up to debate, discuss, and decide and recommend on important issues. I will leave you with a very old Chinese saying from the time of Confucius. Confucius said that setting up a committee is like going to the toilet. First, there's a sitting, then there's a report, and then the matter is dropped. We want to avoid that. We want to make things happen. So I hope in Belarus you make things happen. We all work together to make things happen. It's all about implementation. Thank you for listening to me.